Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to this international session. My name's Chris. I'm with the European Coalition for Corporate Justice. We're based here in Brussels. And I would like to introduce, first of all of our panelists from the four corners of the world who will be speaking with us this morning, this afternoon, about key legislative developments towards mandatory corporate human rights and environmental due diligence and corporate accountability initiatives in their jurisdictions. So without further ado, I'd like to first of all introduce Arnold Kwesiga, who will be representing the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability from Kampala. Also, we have Sylvia Obregon, a colleague of mine from the European Coalition for Corporate Justice in Brussels, Emily Dwyer, representing the Canadian Network for Corporate Accountability, who's calling in from Chelsea, just outside of Ottawa, and last but not least, Fernanda Hoppenheim, who is joining us from Mexico City and is here representing her organization, Project Poder, working in Mexico on corporate accountability initiatives, as well as many other projects, I understand. So as Noor mentioned at the beginning, we do have the chat function. If you would like to raise any questions for the panelists, I'll do my best to filter those through and include them. But I'd like to start by addressing a first question to Arnold, namely, what are the priorities for corporate accountability in your jurisdiction, which in your instance is Africa, of course, and how do robust mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence laws fit into that framework? Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. And thanks, ICAR, for the invitation to be part of this conversation. I will really jump straight into it because the introductions have been made. Some of the key priorities that we're dealing with on the continent when it comes to corporate accountability has really been around the major effects and impact of corporate activities on social and economic rights, but also now looking at a more direct involvement of private actors in provision of social services like health, education, water, electricity. Because of the failures of the states, in most cases, you found that a lot of these social service or public goods, as you may see them, have been channeled into private actors, but then without very clear or strong regulatory mechanisms on regulating the obligations of private actors when they come in to provide social services, which is a huge challenge. And beyond that, you need to understand that a lot of corporate activities, or even large-scale investment and development projects on the continent have really been focused on natural resource exploitation, infrastructure development, a lot of these activities that require huge chunks of land, but also not forgetting that a lot of communities where natural resources are found survive on land. So with that has come huge, massive displacement and unlawful evictions and resettlement of communities, but without engaging, or if you will, without having meaningful consultation and participation of affected communities. So you find that, and largely where the accountability angle fails mostly is that you have a continent whose development agenda is largely focused on private sector-led development. So you find that a lot of the states have anchored their development agenda on private sector development. So they are incomplete with a lot of activities companies do, but also they are focused on creating conducive environments for these private actors to do business. So you find in cases where there have been large-scale abuses and violations, the same state that should be remedying this is in bed with the companies that and the different agencies that are at the heart of the violations. So that raises a lot of issues around corporate capture and conversations that have been had within that front. So that is a lot that is happening. within also the large scale investment and development projects has a huge component of informal sector workers. So you have the largest employees or people within that kind of relationship, work relationship, are within the informal sector. So you find that even employment and labor laws that largely protect people in the formal sector do not extend to a lot of the workers within the informal sector. And then you find then there comes in issues around supply and value chain and these subsidiary companies that are formed for the sake of implementing activities for transnational corporations or multinationals without strong protective cover. So that is a huge problem when it comes to the continent and the way corporate accountability evolves. What is being done? So you find that, unfortunately, in most states, we've had, and I speak about Uganda has had a conversation around developing a new framework called the Social Impact Assessment and Accountability Bill. So going beyond what ordinarily the law and frameworks have been doing to say there is need to have assessments that go beyond environment, go beyond human rights, but look at the social framework of these communities where development and investment is happening, so that you have to engage with them on their usage of land, on their access to social amenities, on their conflict resolution, how those communities address some of these challenges as a way of enhancing corporate accountability. When it comes to social private actors involved in social services, we are now, and through the Center for Human Rights and the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability, within which I operate a lot, we do work very closely with the African Commission. And now we are finalizing in a form of soft law, because it's a general comment on really clarifying state obligations when it comes to regulating private actors involved in provision of social services. So there's the whole conversation around, do obligations of states when they are providing social services, can they be transferred to private actors if they take on the role? Or if not, then what are the responsibilities or obligations private actors take on when they take on provisions of public goods or public services that are always in the hands of the state? So those are conversations that we're having on the continental level, but also not forgetting that there is a huge push, a lot of development partners pushing for development of national action plans on business and human rights and implementing of the UN guiding principles, but also in a way saying, how do we provide or clarify the duties and obligations of states and business when it comes to or in the context of business activities. So there's a lot of that conversation that is ongoing directly. The challenge, and unless if I speak directly on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, unfortunately, we don't have specific frameworks, and I try to look, even the policy on business and human rights from the African Commission does not really touch broadly on the conversation around mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. The good side of it is that a lot of investments or development projects come with funding from either the World Bank or IMF or other lenders that are now demanding mandatory human rights due diligence and environmental to be undertaken on top of human rights impact assessments and environmental impact assessment. But then you have a lot of these projects have been tagged on that funding might not, or lenders will not release funding until there's been a due diligence, environmental and human rights due diligence undertaken. Is it effective? Not really, because now the problem that comes in is that the same companies that are implementing projects are the ones conducting the mandatory human rights due diligences. So you find that the independence and the transparency of these actors then are also in question, because then they will hire a company to undertake this, but then they control the information the company gets and then decide what they will release to the public for any public hearing. But also because it's not codified within the frameworks or within the binding laws that we have, it's felt that a lot of these due diligences undertaken are only done to appease the money lenders or the financial institutions and the different lenders that are funding these projects. So at the end of it all, it feels like it's a tick box that we did this, to move on to the next level or step. Of course, let me stop here for now, but I'll come back if there's any other question that is directed at me. Thanks again, Chris.
Thank you, Arnold, for such a kicking us off and opening quite a few paths forward. This is a very interesting point which you make about the public functionality of private actors, of companies on the African continent, and pushing forward the lawmaking and jurisprudence on asserting certain responsibilities of private actors when they're performing public functions. I wonder, Fernanda, if this is something which Poder, or which we see in Mexico or Latin America as a similar front in corporate accountability work, and perhaps as well you might be able to reflect, as Arnold has just given us some first insights into the role of due diligence at the moment in a non-legislative context in Mexico or indeed Latin America as well. Thanks.
Sure, thank you, Chris. I do think that we have some similarities with what Arnold was just sharing, but there are some particularities of the context in Latin America in terms of, this is the most unequal region in the world. This is the most dangerous region in the world for human rights defenders, particularly those opposing, large-scale projects on the ground for environmental, land and territory defenders. Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico still being the three countries where most, together with the Philippines this year, where most environmental defenders were killed in 2020. So I guess that's one of it's a very particular context, and the proliferation also of large-scale projects in the last 10 years, mining, energy generating, agricultural business, even developments in terms of, infrastructure, hotels, resorts, etc., like really devastating large territories, and of course exploiting natural resources, displacing people, generating social and environmental conflicts. That's kind of the context where we're having this discussion on due diligence. Also, corporate capture of this public decision-making processes of public servants, of different spheres of our democracies and our states. It's very prevailing in our region. So it's a complicated context to have these conversations. And also, but I do think at the same time as having the largest trade agreements with the US and the European Union, and having those two groups of economies as the main economic partners of Latin America, or most countries in Latin America, though we should have a conversation on China at some point. There's a lot of looking towards what's happening in terms of mandatory due diligence, due diligence laws, discussions in the EU and in the US, again, because of all the commercial agreements and also all of the companies from those origins operating in the Latin American context. So there is some discussion about, should we be moving towards mandatory sorts of laws or regulations that really can level the playing field with Europe and the US, but also that can kind of pick up the pace in terms of the discussions. Because so far we only have 3 national action plans in Latin America. Peru was approved last year or a few months ago, then Chile and Colombia. And there is a new discussion in Mexico about a national action plan based on the guiding principles. And of course, that includes, due diligence as part of the discussions, more from a, again, voluntary or policy kind of perspective. And I think the priorities in the region, at least from the civil society and community perspective, is to push for mandatory measures, whether it is, different laws, including due diligence laws, And also considering that this, smart mix that the UN working group promotes and that the UNGPs also promote includes or needs to include legislation. So there's this acknowledgement, there's this interest by companies and governments, not all for sure, but several, to kind of, speed up the pace to get in the same kind of conversations as the EU and the US. And there's a big push, I guess, from civil society and social movements to really have these discussions on mandatory measures. So far, again, we're still in the realm of the voluntary kind of thing. Many companies in those industries I was mentioning that are involved in large scale or mega projects, as we call it them in Spanish, are really reluctant to anything mandatory. They are still discussing whether they should conduct, free, prior, and informed consultations to get the consent from the communities. So in the private sector, the discussion, I guess, it's way behind. And social movements and CSOs and even the academia, I think it's more advanced. And probably the states are in between, trying to keep up with their partners in the EU. That's kind of, I'll stop here, but that's kind of the general landscape of what's going on in the region. We could go deeper in a bit.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Fernanda, for that, situating us in the context of Latin America and giving a bit of a lay of the land, what the status of things is. I imagine Sylvia and Emily would say that the main push is on due diligence laws in both Europe and Canada. Maybe not if it's the case. If there's not something to add on the first question, we can wrap up to the next. Great, being namely whether or not we think that, in light of the fact that human rights and environmental due diligence as a concept, as an increasingly legal concept, is catching global attention, do we think that everyone is actually talking about the same thing when we refer to human rights and environmental due diligence? Are there some risks here? Are there some incongruencies? Are there some discrepancies? And Fernanda, we had you down to answer first on this, and then I would invite Emily, Arnold, Sylvia, just raise your hand if you want to jump in, and we can go to you. Over to you, Fernanda.
Thank you. Sure, I just spoke a lot, so I'll be brief on this one and open the floor for the rest of my colleagues. But I do want to say that I think there's a risk or a challenge, at least from the context I'm in, because we already have, in many countries in Latin America, environmental assessments that are mandatory, for example, for companies. So that is already in the law. And they need to get those environmental permits to be able to operate, right? And in some cases, for example, in Mexico, in the energy sector in particular, there's also, there are also mandatory social assessments, social impact assessments, specifically for industry, for the energy industry, right? Not for the rest of the industries or the sectors. But we already have some components in the national laws that mandate for companies and also together with governmental actors to kind of, do these assessments, present them as part of all the kind of things they need to do to get the permits to operate. So how can we combine that with, human rights mandatory due diligence? What are we talking about again, and as of a few weeks ago, the right to clean environment, it's a human right. So shall we, it was just, adopted by the 48th session of the Human Rights Council. So shall we still talk about it separately? Should it be included in human rights due diligence as a whole? So I think there's the need to clarify some concepts, and also take into account the kind of laws or regulations we already have in our jurisdictions that are actually, due diligence processes related to human rights, including environmental rights. The challenge I think we face in the case of Mexico in particular, it's the one I know best, is that the methodologies are not clear, are not, how do you conduct that due diligence? And I think that's probably a challenge we all share in the regions. So how do you conduct those processes? How do you share that information with, the stakeholders that need to be involved? For example, there have been some companies that haven't made public their social impact assessments. So the communities say, okay, what have you assessed? Who have you talked to? What are the measures you're going to take to prevent harm or mitigate harm, etc. Same with environmental impact assessments. The law here has a provision for participation, but only if the community asks for it. Yeah, you've heard it right. So you need to be online, literally on the internet, searching for, has this company in my territory, sent their environmental assessment for authorities to evaluate. And once it's in the system, then people have, I think it's 15 working days to ask for a participatory process. So that makes no sense, right? First of all, you need to have internet access, then you have to navigate the system, then you need to be on time. And I'm sorry, it's 30 days. Still, short period of time. So so it's learning from what we have, trying to address those challenges and think, what are we going to build if we want, really good laws related to human rights due diligence? What is going to incorporate? What methodologies for the assessments, participation components, etc. So I think that's some of the risks or challenges, at least we're facing in our region, and probably shared by others.
Thanks so much, Fernanda. Yes, it raises the point that, are we all talking about the same thing? And I guess a somewhat related question of how will these new types of laws function between either global south or global north states? Are they going to be the same design? Are they going to incorporate the same elements? What are the already existing elements of what might be deemed due diligence, which exist already, environmental permissions and the like, and of course in the context of developing human rights such as the right to a healthy environment. Sylvia from ECCJ, over to you.
Thanks, Chris and Fernanda. No, I just wanted to say that in Europe, as we have been working on the development of the proposal for mandatory human rights due diligence law at European level, but there have been already several member states that have come forward with the legislation, notably France and Germany recently, and others that are in the process of it. A lot of debate has also come about how do we ensure that these laws do not become a box-ticking exercise, and what are the elements that we need to ensure are part of it so that there is enough deterrence or incentives, as the business prefer to advocate for the companies to actually perform the whole process of identifying, assessing, seizing, preventing, and all the steps that the UNGP and the OECD guidelines have already described as how due diligence should be. So we have identified risks such as, for instance, in some of the conversations, due diligence as a process seems to be sufficient when it's only until the tier 1, when we know that, for instance, it's necessary that due diligence process goes all throughout the value chain, and that's how in the UNGP is established as well. So there are elements that have different discourses, and that we are at risk of not defining the process thoroughly if we don't find also the ways of implementing effective enforcement mechanisms and not sufficient and very robust liability provisions that would ensure that the companies actually do the process. Otherwise, there would be big consequences for them if they don't. So there are risks in interpretation and the elements, and some of those I will go into later, maybe when we discuss more in depth the legislation. But we see that it's very clear that there are risks on the interpretation of what due diligence is, that there are conservative sectors or business sectors in that have a very narrow understanding of due diligence, when civil society and established guiding principles, even though not mandatory, voluntary, as the UNGP and the OECD guidelines, do talk about a much more ample due diligence duty, that it's comprehensive in the scope, that it's also comprehensive in terms of the human rights and the environmental standards that cover, and that has both preventive and remedy provisions in it.
Thanks so much, Sylvia. Yeah, indeed, we know what we're talking about when we talk to the European Commission and parliamentarians. But indeed, there's a lot that can get lost in translation, and there's a lot of people saying a lot of different things. So Emily, are we all talking about the same thing, human rights and environmental due diligence?
I think I share a lot of my co-panelists' concerns already in terms of the extent to which human rights due diligence procedures can be, if they're left to companies themselves, monitoring themselves and undertaking those procedures, can lead to a lot of risk. And some of the elements that Sylvia was talking about around covering all human rights and supply chains. In the Canadian context, we're particularly concerned about human rights due diligence being equated with reporting, more transparency. And our focus has always been on, as Canadian civil society, that human rights due diligence is really about ensuring companies are fulfilling their responsibilities to respect human rights and to prevent harm. So that human rights due diligence isn't actually the goal at the end of this. It's the means by which companies can be achieving that goal. And so that's one of the ways that we're trying to really emphasize this in our conversations and shaping the narrative in Canada. And in particularly also the focus of our legislative proposal is really around ensuring liability. Because if you can include liability, that's a way to help ensure that companies take seriously their obligations to prevent and to put into place robust human rights due diligence procedures. But that human rights due diligence is a term that makes sense for businesses, makes sense for lawmakers, allows us to build on the momentum happening internationally. So it makes sense to be framing what we're talking about within that lens, but to try and keep the conversation on the fact that it's a means to an end, not an end in itself.
Fantastic, thanks, Emily. Touching on that somewhat, or getting to be an age-old debate of, is it a duty of means or a duty of results, the due diligence duty? Is it a duty to prevent harm? Is it a duty to do a process, simply put? We're lucky in the European context to already have non-financial or sustainability reporting laws. So it makes it that much easier to say this is not that. It's not reporting, it's something completely new, and it's a standard. Whether or not it's a standard of process or a standard to prevent harm is something that we sometimes get stuck on as well in discussions. Arnold, over to you. Are we talking about the same things here?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks to the other panelists, because a lot of the things I wanted to raise have been touched, and Fernanda also hit it right on. But we have some of these provisions within our constitution, our legislative domestic legislations. So I remember I had a conversation with one of the justices of the industrial court, and he kept on, she did keep on telling us that we're getting it wrong. We keep trying to look for new legislations when you could use the constitution to hold companies accountable, because we have provisions within the constitutions around, both the state duty to protect, but also ensure that non-state actors respect. And says like there are so many provisions within the supreme law of the land that can be used, that can also look at all these other areas that we are trying to look at. But one of the things that I wanted to mention, and when the conversation around, clarifying some of these concepts and the discussion around, we have a problem, and I think also Emily has touched it, when it comes to the question of liability, but also broadly, companies are so much against strong legislative frameworks from the outside. We have already seen companies are creatures of the law, but once they have been incorporated, they want to self-regulate. And so they have all these internal mechanisms and measures, either through their associations or through their other, operational grievance mechanism, that they want to manage all this within a voluntary manner and nothing around a binding nature from the outside. And so it becomes a huge problem. So when even you look at human rights due diligence or human rights and environmental due diligence, they want the policies that they have come up with, that they are so quick in engagements with them to say there's been violations ABC, they are quick to say, but we did ABCD. So anything that we're supposed to do, we did it. So where did we go wrong? And so then it raises the whole conversation around liability. When, if they are focused on doing the bare minimum, and like Sylvia noted, the bare minimum, but in a way of box ticking. We were supposed to do this, we did it. And so what then becomes the problem from our end? And lastly, we've seen some of these projects, and the point I need to make, some of these projects that they are doing, undertaking all these impact assessments, are very technical. So I got this thought when Fernanda was speaking, that we have seen it even when they undertake human rights and environmental and social impact assessment or human rights impact assessments, let's say for oil and gas, there are so many technical areas to that field that communities affected cannot understand. So we have been having conversations here where, a company and government undertakes an environmental and social impact assessment or human rights impact assessment and releases a 2,000-page document to the community. And then they give the community, here the law provides for public hearings after the report has been published. And they take 2 years to do this study of different sectors, release it to the public and say you have 14 days to comment. And then you're like, you're looking at geological studies and environmental studies and water level, all these are technical areas. So you find that a company is so quick, and the unfortunate bit with the state, they are quick to tick boxes. We did this, we gave you opportunities to engage, and we didn't receive anything. So you find that the technicality of some of these areas also create a huge impediment. So when you ask the question around whether we are speaking the same thing, like, yes, and I've had conversations where I say, you can have all these mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence frameworks released, but how effective are they to address challenges that communities, marginalized and vulnerable communities, illiterate communities in resource-rich areas are impacted and affected? And then how do you ensure that engagements and participation and consultations with communities are effective enough to address the problem, rather than crowding or putting so much information to communities that they actually don't know what is good or bad for them. And they are quick to, and you see like they're so quick to provide all kinds of technical expertise working for the companies. And I've had conversations with oil and gas where they say, we've given project affected person access to lawyers and surveyors and engineers and these to engage with them so that by the time they are consenting, they know what they are doing. And they're like, you're bringing all kinds of technical people to this community that can't read and write for you to sit back and say, we provided them with everything they needed, and this is where we are. So there's a huge challenge, and conversations around this frameworks should be able to look at how do we then make them effective for marginalized and vulnerable communities that are more in a communal setting, are more in this traditional way of life beyond policies and frameworks that speak more from, they look good on paper, but they're not effective on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arnold, for this reality check, I would call it. That, I mean, if we're to operationalize human rights, all sorts of impact assessments and methodologies which you described are oftentimes not human rights friendly at all. They're exclusionary. And if they're not based on a foundation of strong community engagement and support for advocates, and education, then they're not worth the paper that they're written on. So thank you for that, and it does segue your contribution very nicely into the next question, namely, which is, what are the key elements that we would need to see in human rights and environmental due diligence laws in order to make them robust, in order that what aspects of these forthcoming laws do you think are the biggest hope, or that have the biggest potential to initiate a game changer sort of shift? So here we would like to start, first of all, with Sylvia. Over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Well, going back indeed to the conversation with Arnold, how do we make them enforceable in that it's not a box ticking exercise, or that it's an obligation of results rather than of means? And in Europe, civil society has been pushing very strongly for civil liability to be included in the directive. So we're talking about parent company liability and value chain liability regime, and injunctive relief before EU courts. So this is giving the possibility to affected people to bring claims on EU courts whenever there has been harm caused or contributed to by European companies or entities within their value chain. So all across until the last year. This will be a game changer, giving the possibility of bringing those claims directly on the member states, as well as the injunctive relief. This is in case of administrative liability, when the companies would have, for instance, failed in their procedure, and not about remediation the harm, but have failed on the procedure as well. There could be also some sanctions, and those could also end or result in a court case through injunctive relief. Further than that, we think I think it's important also to address other barriers to justice, such as the applicable law. And as ECJ, we're proposing, for instance, that the legislation would include an overriding mandatory provision that would allow the European legislation and the standards of that legislation to override the law of, for instance, where the harm occurred. That very often it has been problematic that EU courts do not know how to read foreign law, and it has ended up in not as the best result for the victims. However, we understand also that this is an intermediary solution, because ideally, and that would require a different type of legal procedure, we would like the European law modified in order to allow for the choice of law, so that the victims can choose with their legal team whenever which one is the most convenient for their case. We also think, I think that also we should look at the competence jurisdiction, so that the national courts of EU member state can accept those claims, that legal standing, for instance, is modified, and that that EU courts could hear collective claims, which is not possible in most of the European national legal systems, at the moment, but it's what is happening in most of the cases of these mega projects that Fernanda was talking about, or the natural resource extraction that also Arnold has referred to, where large amounts of people, a whole community, whole village is affected by a dam or the construction of a dam or a mining project. And right now, the fact that each individual claim has to be brought forward individually means that the costs of these law procedures are really, really high, and that it's very complicated in every individual case to do the whole process of causality and the whole legal procedure. So it would be definitely an improve in access to justice for people, and as well as the burden of proof. We think that there should be a fair distribution of the burden of proof, in which very often the company is in possession of key information and they should be the ones proving that they did everything that could be done, everything that was in their power to not harm or to prevent such harm, to mitigate or address it, depending on what stage the case is. And very often it's impossible for the communities to have access to that proof. So there should be a fair distribution of it, and not only having the plaintiffs have to prove everything at the very early stages of the procedure, which is very costly and very often requires a type of expertise that it's very costly and difficult to get. And a last point, no, there are 2 points more that I wanted to mention: the statute of limitations as well, the time limits in which a claim can be brought in environmental cases, for instance. It is very often difficult for the victims to react in short periods of time, such as short as 1 year in some of the legal systems in the member states of the EU, when harm has been identified. Very often it takes years until the harm is identified in a community, and we have seen it in several cases. And now, because of a recent screening we had, the Bolivian case of toxic waste dumped in Chile comes to mind. After many years, people started having health problems, and they could only bring it to the Swedish courts once the limitations had expired. And the last point should be about addressing the financial risk, also providing the law should take into consideration the differences in power standing and power dynamics, so that it is possible for plaintiffs to bring the claims. So all of these aspects are mainly regarding remediation and deprivation, and how do we make a law, the elements that should be there in the law for it to be robust and deter companies. But then there would be also aspects of enforceability and, for instance, the national entities that should monitor, and that NGOs could have the possibility of bringing complaints or reports and open, and then that's the state would start an investigation over companies once there are serious complaints, as well as in the German law, for instance. This is a possibility. And then again, back to the coverage of the whole value chain, the whole scope of the value chain. There should be also a duty for the company to consult with stakeholders and to report the different stages of the process. And I think that I have been speaking for a while, so I'm going to stop there as well with the elements that could make it stronger.
Maybe before diving in with Emily on the key elements of the Canadian proposal, of which I think there's quite a bit of overlap, but of course very different, very relevant for our ICAR colleagues here, as it's just across the north. But maybe Fernanda, you wanted to jump in first to react to Sylvia and Arnold. I'm not sure if it's an old hand, but of course you're also more than welcome.
Sure, I'll be very quick. I think that In terms of the elements you mentioned, Sylvia, the burden of proof element, I think it's essential. At least, you know, I think when it comes to affected communities, you know, kind of, and on the other side of the table, there's a huge company with a lot of money and resources and power. I think that is essential. But I just wanted to say that for me, if we want this to be focused on prevention, which I think we should, a part of it should be really focused on preventing harm. And then of course, the other part is access to justice with all the elements Sylvia mentioned. I fully agree. I think that if we could at some point connect this initiatives with consent, participation and consent, this would be a game changer. You know, if in a process of due diligence, the communities participating there say no or yes, I mean, that they should be entitled to give or not their consent. So to veto or accept a project. And I really think that, at least in Latin America, that would really change the game. So challenging, right?
Thank you, Fernanda. Over to you, Emily, assuming Arnold, that's an old hand, or did you want to jump in?
So I wanted to jump in just with a very short,
Go for it.
and Fernanda touched it. For me, one of the most, when you look at this mandatory, you know, human rights and environmental due diligence, for me, it's if done right, and if done right well, it helps the company, you know, answer the question of how do they know that they're doing no harm. That should be like the best way to come up with a clear understanding of the operations and how they are impacting different communities. So for me, one of the key questions, one of the key areas, and Fernanda touched it, but also we have touched it in previous discussions or comments, is that they need to have any effective framework around due diligence must have very clear and strong stakeholder engagement plans of how do you deal with affected communities, how do you deal with the vulnerable groups within that. So like it has to be grounded within that clear stakeholder engagement plan, meaningful and transparent, because if the communities affected don't trust it or feel that it's not independent or it's not transparent, then it also doesn't help us deal with the challenges that arise with some of these. So I feel like there is need to look at all these frameworks that are being developed and say, how effective are they when it comes to community participation, consultations, but also other stakeholders that may be affected or impacted by the project, either directly or indirectly. Thank you.
Thanks, Arnold. Yes, new legal rights for victims for participation in the process to enforce those participation and engagement rights, as well as rights to compensation. Sylvia, you wanted to jump in quickly before going to the Canadian.
Sorry. Yes, sorry, Emily, I don't want to take your turn. I just wanted to react quickly to what Fernanda said, because I think it's extremely important to, but the question, at least for me, it has been, how do we pair, because FPIC or free partnering for consent is an obligation for the states right now. And we're talking about a process, the due diligence process being an obligation for the companies. And we have found that for communities that we've worked with around the world, there is a division about trusting whether a process of consent should be in charge of the companies or should it be done by the state. So it really depends on which one is the worst of the actors in the scene there. But it is it's still like a challenging, how do we make it, because it seems like we're talking about the things into different nature, but that clearly need to be related. So if you would have also some insights on that, that would be, yeah, great. Thanks.
Great, thanks. So we have 8 minutes left, and to allow some times for questions from the floor, perhaps, Emily, you wanted to, first of all, explain to us what are the main what's going on in Canada? If you can give us a quick update, and meanwhile, if people would like to start putting their questions in the chat, we can get to them as well for the last part of our time together.
Perfect. I'll be very brief, and I'll try. I'm not just interested in talking about our proposal in Canada, but can link it back to some of the conversation that was just being had too. So I'll put links into the chat so people can look if they're interested. We published a model law in the spring. We have an executive summary and the full legislation that we can put there. And it's the product of years of consultation and outreach, but we can boil it down to kind of 3 principal elements. One is that it would impose a duty to prevent on Canadian companies and those selling goods into Canada throughout their supply chains and global operations. 2, it would impose a duty on companies to undertake due diligence, including consulting with rights holders and reporting annually. And 3rd, it would include enforcement. So part of that would be a commissioner that could impose fines if companies are not reporting. And 2nd, access to Canadian courts for 2 pieces. And I think that is the part that might be most interesting here, is that the way that we have conceptualized that access to courts piece is that impacted communities could file a lawsuit in Canada if a Canadian company or those in their supply chains caused harm, or impacted communities or others representing them could file a lawsuit in Canada for a company's failure to exercise due diligence. So prior to harm, because at its core, what we're trying to get at is what Fernanda was talking about, which is prevention. So we also included what's referred to in the legislation as a limited defense, but it ultimately gets down to being partly a shift of the burden. A community would need to demonstrate that they were harmed, and then a company could seek to defend themselves from liability if they could demonstrate that they had undertaken effective due diligence. So the standard is not just that due diligence procedures have been put into place, but that they were effective. Linking back to the conversation that we just had, I should say this is a civil society proposal. There's lots of interest and support. We're going to see it or a version of it in the House of Commons, but it's not passed into law. It's not a government initiative right now, just to be clear. But linking back to the last part of the conversation is that in reference to human rights, we made explicit mention to the right to a healthy environment. And we also included UNDRIP there. So the hope, the aspiration is that companies, you could be ensuring that companies are having to follow the guidance in UNDRIP, and that part of a company's due diligence around consultation and consent, for example, is saying, do we have confidence that that consultation in this area done by this state would have been effective? That's part of your due diligence procedure as a company. So not, anyways, just to kind of put that in there. It's great to be here. This has been a really rich conversation. I hope we haven't taken over too much time of all of your questions as we've been asking questions of each other.
And some responses to the questions in the chat. I would invite for the last few minutes, if there's any questions or any more questions from the audience specific to either the African, Latin American, European, or Canadian context. We've also shared some different resources in the chat as well. But failing any questions, then I would ask Fernanda, maybe picking up on your last point, Emily, if I understood you right, were you saying that the obligation of a company as part of due diligence would be to ensure that the state itself has done FPIC? free, prior, informed consent. And maybe Fernanda, if you wanted to jump in on this question and the issue of consent as raised by Sylvia.
I drafted a few lines on the chat, but I think, I mean, we could think outside the box, right? What I do think in terms of prevention, part of being preventive is making sure the community is okay with you having that that project in their lands or in the area of influence, as they call it. So I mean, I think that making sure the state conducted FPIC processes, but it's not compulsory for all states if they are not part of the conventions, right? So, I mean, in many states where due diligence laws are being discussed, or where civil society is promoting for the due diligence laws to be discussed, they are not part of the 169 or any other conventions related to FPIC, or that have some components. So not necessarily compulsory for those states. I do think that we might want to ask companies to get the consent of the communities as part of the due diligence processes if we want to add another demand. I think it's an idea worth discussing.
Certainly, yes, and I would say if companies can advocate for it, so can we. And just this recently in the European context, a group of cocoa companies, chocolate companies, as well as NGOs have indeed been calling for due diligence legislation to include not only FPIC, but recognition of traditional forms of communal indigenous collective ownership of land. So you can see that on our Twitter feed at ECCJ, if indeed that's something useful for your advocacy. There has just been placed in the chat right now the Zoom link to the next session, which I understand is an awards ceremony. So how exciting. Please go ahead and follow that link. And if there are no last remaining comments from the panel or anybody else, then we might leave it here. And I'm sure we'll all see each other sometime before the next ICAR AGM. Thank you all so much for your time. A big thanks to the speakers for taking all the time wherever you are. And we look forward to touching base when legislation starts to come in for the next stage of the discussion, implementation, and all of that. Have a good weekend. Take care.